Hi everyone, this is Steincamp from the Chess Summit Network, and this is my second part of my positional mini-series. If you remember from my first part, I talked a little bit about optimization. And optimization is the idea that you're going to put your pieces in the best possible squares that could be in the opening, so they have to move as few times as possible later in the middle game. And as you may recall, the game that I went over was a Roslimo, where white didn't exactly understand the ideas of the opening, so knight gf6, rook e1, b5, bishop f1, and continually throughout the game, this light squared bishop became a problem because he never found that right square, that right idea that he needed to execute in order to have a good game. And so for today's mini lecture, I want to talk a little bit about thematic ideas. Thematic ideas go hand in hand with optimization because thematic ideas essentially are ideas that have been played thousands of times by grandmasters have been proven to work. So for example, let's take a Benoni defense. If you're not familiar with the Benoni, that's okay. But the idea is I play c5 now, e6, knight c3, takes, d6, and black's going to have the traditional pawn push of a6, b5, whereas white's probably going to play on the king's side and try to force this d pawn to capture an e5, so he ends up has d pawn in the center while having a lot of pressure on the king's side. So those are thematic ideas for both sides, and generally you try to execute those plans as the game progresses. So for today's little mini video, I have two games that I want to show, and I'm going to split this video into two parts, and this will be part one. Part one will be an example of a game that I played and lost because I didn't execute the correct thematic ideas and in turn didn't optimize my pieces correctly. Whereas in part two will be a game that I played in the same tournament, in the same opening, where it's much clearer that I did a much better job of being active and pursuing a better completion of optimizing my pieces. So without further ado, this is a game that I played at the Continental Class Championships in 2013. My opponent was like 9 years old, so I was a little bit disappointed to lose this game, but I think having played this game at the time helped me have a better understanding of the Najdorf Sicilian. So e4, c5, knight f3, d6, and d4, going in traditional Najdorf lines. So this is all main theory. Okay, so my opponent plays f3 here, and this is a very flexible move. My opponent can make the game into a Marozzi if he wants to by playing c4, or you can convert it into a bishop e3 line of the Sicilian, and this can get kind of tricky, and if black doesn't really know what to do, white usually gets pretty good positions. And if I'm not mistaken, e5 is the correct idea here, forcing the knight to go back to b3 and trying to find ways to push this pawn to d5, but not being familiar with the ideas of this opening, I played knight c6 with the idea of maybe if white plays knight takes c6, I can take with the b pawn, and I have somewhat of a solid position. I can play g6 and fianchetto probably, and I'm okay. But my opponent does not take my knight, he plays bishop e3, and I exchanged these pieces quite quickly, thinking that I'm better in this position, because I just got a tempo on this bishop, and, well, I have a little bit more space in the center, but this is not quite correct. In fact, I'm definitely wrong in this position. I don't really have a square to go with either one of my bishops. This bishop here on c8, which is my more active bishop, is e6 and d7, but none of these squares can really be occupied. And from e6, there's no real plan here. You know, white doesn't have to immediately castle queenside. Meanwhile, this bishop on e7, bishop on f8 can go to e7, but it doesn't do much besides stop a potential pin on g5. And if I fianchetto the bishop, it's just pointed at an e5 pawn that's blocked off by this e4 pawn. So both my bishops are already somewhat obsolete. So white's already starting to win the opening battle. I play bishop e6, just a natural developing move. I don't want my opponent to play bishop c4. My opponent plays g4, and after h6, queen d2, he's converted it completely into a bishop e3 line, except this line is much better because white now has this nice kingside expansion, and at the time my preparation was if white immediately went to bishop e3 line, I was going to play h5 immediately, stopping this g4 idea, so if he played g4, I have h takes g4. But in this position, playing h5 is no longer possible because black has to deal with this move, g5, at some point, and then this becomes quite disgusting, frankly, for black to have to play. As you already may notice in this position, I also have the additional weakness of my pawn on d6 is not doing me any favors in this position, so while white is attacking on the king's side, he can also put pressure on d6, so white's pieces are already somewhat optimized and put in the right spaces. I played bishop e7. I didn't really have another move to make, so I just decided here I should castle, but already I can tell I'm definitely a little bit worse. My opponent can choose to pawn storm with h4 if he wanted to. The other idea is get the bishop out, queenside castle, and just play solid positional chess. There's no need to rush this advantage if you're white. He castles, and I try to play queen a5 with the idea of some sort of counterplay. but there really isn't anything effective here. And as you'll see, if you're a Sicilian Najdorf player, you'll know that these squares aren't the great squares that you want to have with your minor pieces to attack the queen side. In fact, it's going to be somewhat ineffective. After king b1, all of my ideas are somewhat gone. So I lashed out with b5, and this is actually a mistake, because white has this nice knight d5 move with an attack on my queen, and if I take queen takes like I did in the game, he has this nice switch and zig, or intermezzo check of knight takes f6 check. And so in this position, black is much worse, and there really isn't much to do besides queen takes d2. Obviously, if I take the knight, my queen hangs, and if I move my queen, white just has this really nice outpost on d5, and I have these awkward pawns in b5 and a6, and it's not quite clear what I want to do with my king. So queen takes d2 is really my only option. Here I played bishop takes f6, and the reason why this position is so bad for me now is this exchange helped white because now my bishop is on f6, which is arguably a worse square than e7, because at least from e7 I was defending the pawn. Now from f6 I'm pointing to e5, and there's nothing to really be had in this direction, and going to h4 is not really going to do me any good right now. So I played this dubious move, queenside castling, to protect the pawn, and this isn't such a great idea. In fact, my opponent found a way to exploit it immediately on his next move. But, I mean, king e7 blocks in the bishop, that's not too great. Your rook d8 might have been slightly better than queenside castling, but the honest truth is there's just really nothing to be had in this position if you're black. So I queenside castled and he played a4, which I think is worthy of an exclam, because now my pawns are really going to be weak on my queen side, and because white's pieces are optimized and pointed in that direction already, see with the bishop on f1 and the bishop on e3, I have obvious glaring weaknesses on the queen side that I'm going to have a hard time protecting, while white's going to be able to attack them easily as the bishops are already activated and ready to go. Notice how even from f1, this bishop is optimized because it's controlling squares that are really helpful for white. I played bishop c4. This is probably a mistake, but I honestly don't know what else I could have done. And the reason why I say it's probably a mistake, even though this trade of this e6 bishop with this f1 bishop looks good, if you look at the rest of my pieces after this trade, this bishop on f6 is really not going to be doing any favors for me, and this rook on h8 is not really making an impact on the game. Meanwhile, white's plan is fairly easy. Put pressure in d6, and then I have a weak pawn here on c4 and a weak pawn here on a6, and my counterplay is non-existent, if any. So I played king c7 to protect the pawn, and my opponent found this nice move, rook d5. My thematic idea that I should have been executing was to push this d5 pawn, try to get rid of this backwards pawn. Maybe if these two pawns trade, this f3 pawn's a weakness, and maybe I have something going. But with my opponent plays rook d5, I now no longer have any options, and I always have pieces pinned down to this d6 square. So this bishop here is probably my only piece that I can really get active right now. I play king c6, and my opponent plays b3. I was a little bit happy to trade off my weakness here, but the honest truth is this c-file is just a glaring weakness right now in my position. I played rook d7. My opponent plays bishop d2. This is a really good idea because the bishop from e3, while it was optimized before, it's not doing anything at this point. e4 is covered, c5 is covered, b6 is covered, and a7 is covered. So by moving the bishop on d2, it's just an example of how an optimized piece can easily make a transition in the middle game to a better square. So the idea is maybe bishop to g2 to bishop b4 with the threat of the pawn, or maybe even to bishop a5 with the ideas of like b4, b5 check, and having the b6 square under control might create a mating net. So this is a very good idea. My opponent shows how if your pieces aren't optimized, you could be in some serious trouble in the middle game. So I, on this move, decided it's time to get my other rook in the game. I played rook b8, attacking the pawn, and my opponent wisely chose king a2. Obviously, king a2 is better than king c2 because the rook can't get on the c5 with check at that point, and having the king on b2 is unnecessary as it pins the b pawn to the king, and maybe I find a way to play rook takes a4 with a pin on the king. It's a long shot, but this is the most prophylactic measure to defend the pawn. I played rook on d to b7. My opponent found rook c1 check, and I played king d7. In this position, it's starting to become clear that I don't really have a plan. I need to just defend this d6 pawn, defend this a6 pawn, and maybe try to find a way to get this bishop into the game. But one indicator that you may be familiar with bishop endings is that opposite-colored bishops are usually a draw, whereas same-colored bishops probably means it's a decisive result in the position. And if you notice, white's pawns are pretty much on light squares, whereas mine, for the most part, are on dark squares, taking away this weakness on a6 and this kind of nothing pawn on f7. So I'm going to have a hard time finding a way to get this bishop in the game. rook c3. I offer the rook trade to simplify, and I had this idea of bishop h4, but really it's too little too late. Even from f2, this bishop still isn't optimized. It can go to d4, but even there, I can't control the light squares at this point. So white's already pretty much completed all of the optimizing he needs to do. He's ready to attack. My opponent plays king c3, and I played rook c8, and after he played king b3, I thought maybe he doesn't know how to win, so I played rook b8 again, but he found rook a5, and rook a5 is just crushing. This a6 pawn's a serious weakness. I could play rook b6, but there's complicated lines where he might have this idea of b5 check after bringing his king to c4, and white's just better. So I played bishop b6 hoping to trap the rook, but after rook takes a6, there's no real way to go about it because I can't control the light squares in this position. So I played king b7, he had b5, and the win was quite easy. So in reflection of this game, I wanted to talk about thematic ideas, right? So how do thematic ideas and optimization go hand in hand? Well, you notice in this game, I was pretty much passive the whole game, and my opponent pretty much dictated the speed of the game, and he got to decide what he wanted to do. And his thematic ideas were easy. He just maneuvered on the king side, played g4, stopping any sort of kingside counterplay. Then, after queen d2, bishop e7, queenside castles, he's like, okay, well now I'm going to put pressure on d6. And because I'm not trying to get rid of this weakness, white's always going to have a target in this position. So even in the last position, so let's say rook takes a6, this d6 pawn still hasn't moved, and white, this could be a potential target still later in the game. And so I haven't really done my job as the Sicilian player in his opening. So that's it for part 1. In part 2, I'm going to show a pretty much direct contrast, what it looks like when black does play these thematic ideas and why it's so important that you follow the thematic ideas. Because following the thematic ideas means that you're optimizing your pieces and you're putting them not only on the best squares, but squares that have been proven to work over and over and over again. Thank you very much. This is Isaac Steincamp in part 1 of Thematic Play.